In this video, I'll be showing you exactly step by step how to make this flower ring using some sheet metal and wire. I'm also going to be using beginner-friendly or low-cost tools, and I'll have links to all of them in the description below or the first pinned comment. So to get started, let's go over the sizing of the materials I'll be using, and you don't have to use the same size of materials that I'm using. They're more or less just starting points. And the silver material I'll be using this are a little unconventional in their size because I made these from scratch using my rolling mill. And the brass wire is pre-made, that's why it's at 2mm exactly pretty much. I personally like to use millimeters for everything, but normally when it comes to actually buying your materials, it's going to be in gauge. And I do have a helpful tool that will help me figure out what gauge things are, which comes in really handy if you forgot what you ordered, or if you made your own materials. And all you do is find a slot that fits the material, and that's what size it is. And by fits, it's going to be pretty snug in there. When it comes to my silver material, it's kind of a weird size like I was saying, so it's not going to fit anything perfectly. But you'll at least have a rough estimate of what it is. But definitely a very handy tool, especially if you're doing a lot of jewelry making. I'm also going to be using two different types of solder with different melting points. And this is because I'm going to be using multiple solder joints in the same spot, and this will keep things from falling apart. And these are 1mm chips, but you can also use solder paste if you want to. And the last thing before we get started, you don't have to use silver to make this ring. If you only have copper or brass available, you can do that like I did with this ring. But if you are using copper or brass, make sure to check out my other video showing how to seal them so they don't stain your skin green. Let's get started on the first part of this ring, which is the flower part. And I've actually made some helpful templates so you can make this shape easily, along with a few other designs as well, depending on what you like. And I'm going to use one of these fine tip Sharpies to trace it out, but you can also use a metal scribe to scratch it into the metal. And I'll be using the 15mm template, but of course you can use a bigger or smaller one depending on what you want to make. Just make sure you take your time when tracing it so we have a clean line to follow when sawing this out. And if you're using Sharpie to do this and you mess it up, you can always just wipe it off and start again. We're going to have to use a bench pin for this along with a jeweler's saw. There are different size saw blades that you can choose from, but for everything in this video I'll be using 2/0 blades. And before doing any sawing, make sure that you use some sort of cut lubricant. If this is the first time you've ever used a jeweler's saw to cut out a pattern, just keep in mind that it's not the easiest thing to just pick up and do. There is a bit of a learning curve to actually using the saw. And I have a video on the basics on how to use one that might come in handy if that's the case. But other than that, just take your time with it, go slow, and stay on the outside of the pattern lines. And if it's not perfect, it's totally fine. We can always clean it up after the fact, because you can always remove more material, but you can't add it back. One thing to keep in mind when using gold and silver is when you saw it out, you're making a bunch of sawdust, and you're going to want to save this because it adds up quickly. And my workbench has a little catch at the bottom just for this, and this is all the silver sawdust I have from just cutting this one piece out. So make sure to keep it and recycle it later. But anyways, here's my flower all cut out. Definitely not my best sawing work, but that's pretty normal when I have to work around cameras and lights in the way. And it does have some rough edges going on, so I'm going to clean that up using a rotary tool. And these radial bristle brushes come in really handy for that. And this is a 220 grit option, and it makes quick work of smoothing everything out. And there we go, it's much better than it was, and this is completely usable now. Because I made all the silver, it's all work hardened right now, so I'm going to have to soften it or anneal it. And to do that, I need to heat both of them up with a torch. And oddly enough, you can actually use a Sharpie to help you with this, because the ink will burn off around the temperature that this all becomes annealed. I personally like to use this honeycomb board, and I have it elevated off of my work area using a tripod. And I'll be using this butane torch for this, along with all the soldering I do in this video. Depending on the size of your material, the annealing process can be pretty quick, and it's more or less getting everything up to temperature and keeping it there for a couple seconds. And once you're all done, you can either just let this sit here for a while and cool down on its own. I typically just throw them directly into my pickling solution because the heating process will make them oxidized a little bit and they need to be cleaned anyways. And a helpful tip for smaller parts, you can always use a container like this, put some of your pickling solution inside of it, and it'll float on top. And then you could throw your small parts inside of it. Normally it'll end up sinking, but everything will stay in it, and you can grab it all out at once. Just be careful when pouring the liquid back into the pot because you don't want to dump everything into it. And make sure to rinse off your pieces in some clean water. And now I can use this, which is a dapping block. This will allow me to dome the flower into a kind of cupped shape. As you can see, there's a lot of different size options, and I'm only using one of the many punches that you can use with this. And all I really need to do is put the flower into one of them that it fits and hammer it into shape. The smaller the hole you put it into, the sharper of a bowl shape you'll get. So this will all be preference, and different size punches can help you shape it into larger or smaller sizes. So you can always make a few extra flowers and try out some different combinations until you find something you like. But however you dome it, it is going to be domed, and we need a flat spot on the bottom to actually solder it to our ring. So using some tweezers to hold it in place, I'm going to file down the back of this so it's nice and flat. And there we go, I have a nice flat spot now. And with that all done, we can move on to the next step, which is making the little brass balls that are going to go inside the flower. And we're going to be making them out of this piece of brass wire. And to help me do that, I'm going to be using a wire jig. This will allow me to set the length that I want my pieces cut to, along with hold my wire in place. And now I can use my jeweler saw to cut these to the same size every time. And of course, you don't have to use this tool. You can always use your calipers to mark out exactly where you need to be cutting. This tool just makes it a lot quicker and easier to do, especially when cutting a lot of the same size. But you might have noticed that these are cylinders and not balls. And I'll be able to fix that problem pretty quickly just using a torch. Because if you heat this up enough, it will melt and the surface tension will turn it into a ball. And the torch I'm using is able to do this pretty quickly. Just be careful if you're using a hotter torch than this one, because you can overheat this metal and it will explode. So basically, as soon as you see it turn into a ball, take the heat away. And when it stops glowing and looking liquidy, you can pick it up with some tweezers and throw it into your pickling solution. And here's all of them done, with some extras in case I drop them and they decide to disappear. And you might notice that these are more copper looking than brass. And this is very common when you heat up brass like this, and put it into the pickling solution. There is kind of a weird way to get rid of this if you wanted to. In a separate container, you can add some hydrogen peroxide to your pickling solution with a little bit of salt, and mix it all together and let it sit there for a bit. And you can watch this solution start to eat away all the copper on the outside, leaving just dull yellow metal. Just make sure you set a timer for this for about 10 minutes, and don't forget brass inside of the solution, or it will continue to eat all the copper in the material and make it extremely brittle and weak. But once they're done and to your liking, rinse them off in some clean water, and you can even polish them up by just rubbing them around on a paper towel. And you can see they come out surprisingly shiny. And it's good to test fit them onto your flower piece to see how many of them you actually need, and to test out what the design's going to look like. We do have to build one more thing, which is the ring band. So let's get that done really quick, and then we can start putting everything together. I do need this wire to be as straight as possible, and typically when you get wire, it's never going to be straight anyways. So here's a quick and easy way to get it straight enough. I suggest using a steel bench block or any hard, smooth metal surface. And be careful using aluminum because you can dent it. But whatever you use, make sure that your metal is annealed, that way it's pliable. Using a rawhide mallet so I'm not marring the piece at all or making marks on it, I'm going to hammer it down gently to get any of the larger bends out of it. And then all I need to do is kind of roll the wire like this while pushing down firmly with the hammer, and it should start to straighten out. And it doesn't have to be perfectly straight, it just has to be straight enough. With that being done, we need to at least square up one of the ends of the wire. That way we can get some proper measurements and make sure that the ring is going to be the right size. You can cut a small triangle into your bench pin, line it up here, and file the end of this off, which will make it flush enough for the next step. But there's also a nice tool that makes this perfect every time called a miter block. It's a very simple concept, but extremely helpful. It's made of hardened steel, and you can clamp your material inside of it and file directly onto the surface. And when doing this, I actually use the hole in my bench pin to feed the material through, so I have a good surface to file on. And after just a little bit of filing, you have a perfectly flat surface. And with the wire all set up, now I need to figure out what size ring we're going to be making. And to do that, I'm just going to use a ring sizer and test my own finger, so it's going to be a 10.5. And using my calipers, I'm going to measure the inside diameter of the ring, which is about 20 millimeters, and you're going to want to write that down somewhere. The next important measurement is actually the wire we've been working with, because this is going to be the band of the ring, and it's about 2.2 millimeters. And with those measurements, we can find out exactly how much material we need to make a ring in the right size. So first I'm going to take the wire thickness, which is 2.2, and multiply that by 0.85, which is 85%, and then add the internal diameter, which was 20, and then finally multiply that by 3.14 or pi, and that will give us the exact length that we would need to make a circle in the proper size. I know the math of this scares a lot of people away, but honestly it is very simple and pretty much just plug and play. And all you really do is plug in the two measurements you took into this equation and do it in the order I showed. And don't worry about the other numbers that are there, like the 3.14 or the 0.85, they're always going to be exactly the same. I'm going to round that number up just a little bit and set my calipers to that size, locking them in place as well. Using the flat end of the wire, I'm going to hook my calipers on there and use the other end to scratch the metal. And this will mark exactly where I need to cut. And that's why I rounded up a little bit, because I'm going to have to saw through this, which takes away material, and I'm going to have to file it, which takes away a little bit more material. And now that I have the exact size that I need, I can bend this around my ring mandrel to start getting it into a ring shape. But first it's going to be a U shape that I'll hammer the ends down lightly to make it into a round ring shape. And it'll end up looking a little like this, which still still isn't a ring shape, and we need to bring these two ends together, but they need to be completely flush together to solder properly, and I'm going to use some pliers to help me bend the metal, but you don't want to bend the metal with too sharp of an angle in it because you'll never be able to get that out, which you can see right here as I'm trying to keep this curve going. Just take your time moving each side one at a time, and once you get them close enough, you can move them apart from one another like this, and push them past one another, which will make it kind of like a spring, and then slide them back, and it will put its own pressure holding them together. Just make sure they're completely parallel, and hold it up to the light to see if you can see anything through the crack. If you can't see anything, then you're ready to solder. But if you can, you might need to adjust it a little bit more, or you can even run your jeweler saw through that area, and it should make it completely flush. For the soldering process, I'm going to be using something called Flux, which is meant for higher temperatures, even though it says for low temperature brazing. I also like to transfer this into a different container, and I even add a little bit of water to it to make it usable with the paintbrushes that I use to apply it. I'm going to solder this on a charcoal block, and I only need to apply the flux at the solder joint. And using my torch, I'm just going to heat it up enough that it dries it out, and then grab a piece of hard silver solder and place it onto the charcoal block, and then I can actually pick up the ring and put the solder joint on top of it. And the reason why I'm doing it this way is because solder likes to flow to the hottest point, so it will defy gravity and flow up into the joint from here. And now I can solder it together, heating up the ring evenly with my torch, and then focusing on the solder joint once everything gets up to temperature, and you can see the solder climb up the solder joint. And it looks like the solder flowed pretty good with no gaps or anything like that, so I'm going to throw this into my pickle pot to get it all cleaned up. And I can finally shape this into an actual round ring shape using my Mandrel and a Rawhide Mallet. And there we go, it's all rounded out and the right size. And of course I can test fit it and it fits with no problem. But after all that hammering, you do have to make sure that everything is flat, and I do that on my bench block using my Rawhide Mallet as well. And it's just a few light taps on either side and it should come out pretty flat. There is one more thing we have to do to this band, and that's make a flat spot on it so we can solder our flower on and have a good base for that. And I'm going to use my miter block to do this actually, so I have a perfectly flat surface. Just clamp the ring in place with a little bit of it sticking out and file it flat. And there we go, we have a perfect spot for soldering that flower piece onto. And to hold all this in place, we're going to use a third hand with some cross-lock tweezers, and I'll have the flower part face down on my solder block, and make sure you have both flat areas meeting up with one another so you don't have a gap like this. So with that adjusted and to my liking, I'm going to add some flux and dry it out like I normally do before adding 2 pieces of hard solder on either side of the band. And now I'm going to try to evenly heat up this entire piece, and once the flux starts to go a little bit clear, I'll move my torch to the part where I want my solder to flow, and you should be able to see both pieces of solder flow underneath the 2 pieces. And there we go, both pieces are completely soldered together now, and this is going directly into the pickle pot to get cleaned off, and it looks like it came out looking pretty good. But even though it looks good, I'm going to check the solder joint by pulling on the 2 pieces to make sure it doesn't snap apart, because if the solder didn't fully fuse these 2 things together, it's better for it to fail now, where I can fix it easily, than later. I'm also going to take the opportunity to sand down the inside of this a little bit, just because it becomes a lot harder to do once I add the other parts. And speaking of adding the other parts, I can finally do that now. And I'm going to use the cross-lock tweezers again to hold this, and again I'm just going to flux the area I'm going to be soldering in and dry it out with my torch. And the difference this time is I'm going to be using the easy solder, which has a much lower melting point than hard solder. That way I can solder right on top of an area I've already soldered on without melting it. And I'm just going to put a couple pieces inside of the flower cup, and without adding the balls in, I'm going to heat this up just until the solder starts to flow and stop. That way they're stuck in place and they won't move around when I do add the balls to this. I am adding a little bit more flux to this right now when I probably didn't have to. If you do as well for whatever reason when it's hot, just be careful because you can burn or melt the bristles on your brush. And with it being hot, it pretty much dries itself out pretty quick. I also made sure to coat all the brass in flux as well, and if I do this while it's hot, they kind of just stick in place. From there, I just need to heat it up slowly. As you can see, it kind of bubbles around, so you want to make sure stuff doesn't move too much, but it usually settles back down where you wanted it. And if it doesn't go where you want it, you can always move it back using some tweezers or a solder pick. But I'm just going to keep heating this and watch it carefully. I'm looking for the solder to start creeping up around the brass, along with the flux to turn clear. And at the same time, I don't want to melt any of the petals, so it's a nice little balancing act. But once everything looks right, I can remove the heat, and you can see that everything is stuck in place. And with some tweezers, I'm just going to prod around and make sure nothing is loose. And then back into the pickling solution it goes, and here's how it looks after everything. And it seems like everything turned out how I wanted it to, and of course everything's going to have this weird matte finish to it, paint. So I'm going to clean that up, and this is kind of where you can pick your finish as well. So for instance, if I want a more brushed look, I can use my 220 grit radial disc and just kind of go over everything, and it'll end up looking like this, which is totally usable. But I'm going to go for a more bright and polished look. And to do that, I need to use some polishing tools. And if you already have a rotary handpiece, you can use some polishing buffing wheels for that. And when using a setup like that, I like to use a ring clamp like this one. It's really quick and easy to use and has a screw down mechanism to hold things in place. And it actually clamps down pretty tight, so you don't need to worry about your piece falling out. I also really like to use finger guards because the metal gets really hot when polishing, along with it being very dangerous to wear just normal gloves when using rotary tools, because if it gets caught, it could break your fingers or hand. But if that happens to the finger guards, they just kind of come off. When it comes to the polishing compound, this is the one I like to use most of the time, but there's definitely a lot of options out there for different metals. Unfortunately, this video is already long enough, and polishing can be an entire video on its own. And keep in mind that polishing is extremely messy and it's throwing the polish around everywhere. So if you don't have a filtration setup for this, make sure you're wearing some sort of mask, along with safety goggles. And you can get by using a handpiece to polish your pieces, but a dedicated polishing motor is much better. But with whatever polishing setup you go with, you're going to have to clean off your piece because it'll be covered in polishing compound. A cheap and very effective way to do this is to use a toothbrush along with some hot water and dish soap. But if you're looking for something more automated and can do more than one at a time, you're going to want an ultrasonic cleaner. You can fill this up with different types of cleaning solutions and has a mesh basket to hold everything. On top of that, it has a built-in timer and heater, and with this machine on, you can see how quickly it starts to remove that polishing compound. And I typically just leave things in here for about 5 to 10 minutes. And they usually come out perfectly clean, just make sure you rinse it off in some clean water. And there we go, we have a fully handmade ring that is nice and polished and fits perfectly. You can also use these as stackable rings, so you can put more than one together and get a different look, or stack other rings with it. Overall, I like how the design of this came out. It's also a good stepping stone for anyone that is currently learning how to make jewelry, and hopefully it inspires you to make one even if it's not a flower. And if you stayed this long through the video, I would like to give you a 15% discount on my website. So if you want to pick up any of the templates that I make, along with any other tools or storage setups, feel free to check out my website. I'll have links in the description, or just go to GomeowCreations.com. Well, I think that's pretty much it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!